John's phone buzzed just as he was getting ready to settle into bed. The caller ID read unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something compelled him to answer this time. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a man speaking in hurried tones. "Mr. Smith? This is Jeremy. I work with your wife, Madeline. I'm sorry to call you this late, but there's a situation." "Madeline? Well, she's had a bit too much to drink at the corporate party. She's not in a state to drive, and we were hoping you could pick her up." John's heart sank. It wasn't like Madeline to lose control like this. "Where is she now?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "She's at the venue still, but it's a bit chaotic here. The party was supposed to be winding down, but some people are still lingering. She's in one of the back rooms resting. I can wait with her until you get here." John thanked him, hung up, and grabbed his keys. His mind raced during the drive, a flurry of questions bombarding him. Why had she gotten so drunk? Was something wrong at work? He'd seen her off earlier that evening, dressed to the nines, her laugh bright and full of energy. What could have happened since then? The venue wasn't far, a sleek hotel in the city center. Pulling into the parking lot, he noticed several people milling about, some laughing loudly, others stumbling in various states of inebriation. As he approached the entrance, the thudding bass of music was palpable, and the air was heavy with the smell of alcohol and perfume. Inside, the party seemed to still be in full swing, despite the late hour. Jeremy, the man who'd called, was waiting near the door. He looked relieved to see John. "She's this way," he said, leading him through the crowded room. John's eyes scanned the crowd as they walked, spotting a few familiar faces from Madeline's office. He noticed how some people glanced at him, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. Unease prickled at his skin. Jeremy stopped outside a private lounge. "She's in here," he said, hesitating slightly before adding, "Well, you'll see." Pushing open the door, John stepped inside. The scene before him made his stomach lurch. Madeline was slumped on a plush sofa, her hair disheveled, her dress slightly askew. She looked up at him with bleary eyes, but what struck him most was the man sitting beside her. It was her boss, Martin. Martin quickly stood, smoothing his shirt. "John, good to see you. Madeline's had a bit of a night, but we were just chatting while she sobered up." John's eyes darted between them, taking in every detail, the way Martin's hand lingered on the back of the sofa, the faint smear of lipstick on his collar that wasn't his wife's shade, the way Madeline avoided his gaze entirely. "What's going on here?" John demanded, his voice low and cold. "Nothing," Madeline slurred, trying to sit up straighter. "Just too much champagne." Martin stepped forward, his tone placating. "It's not what it looks like. She just needed some air, and I offered to keep her company." John's fists clenched at his sides. "I think you've done enough. I'll take it from here." He helped Madeline to her feet, but as they turned to leave, she stumbled, a small envelope falling from her clutch. John bent to pick it up, noticing the hotel's logo embossed on the front. Inside was a key card. "What's this?" he asked sharply. Madeline's face went pale, but before she could answer, Jeremy, who had followed them inside, spoke up. "That's for one of the suites. A bunch of us booked rooms in case we drank too much. Company policy, safety first." John's eyes narrowed. "A bunch of you? Or just her?" The silence was deafening. The ride home was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Madeline kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping her lap. John couldn't bring himself to speak, his mind replaying the events of the night, each detail twisting the knife deeper. When they finally pulled into their driveway, he turned to her. "Madeline, I need the truth. Why did you really get so drunk? And what were you doing with Martin?" Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "It wasn't what you think, John. Please, just trust me." But trust felt like a distant memory. John had barely slept after the chaotic events of the previous night. Madeline had stumbled to bed without another word, leaving him alone with his spiraling thoughts. His mind was a whirlpool of anger, doubt, and dread. Every detail of the night replayed in excruciating slow motion, Martin's overly familiar demeanor, the key card, and the murmurings of judgmental colleagues at the party. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and John couldn't ignore it. By morning, John was determined to get answers. He left Madeline sleeping and called her office under the pretense of checking in on her workload. The receptionist's hesitation before answering told him everything he needed to know. "Here, Mr. Smith," the receptionist said uneasily. "But, it might be better if you come by yourself." His heart sank. "What's going on?" "It's hard to explain. I think it's best you see for yourself." The drive to Madeline's office felt endless. John's stomach churned with every possible scenario his imagination conjured. Was she still drunk? Had she done something she didn't remember? And what had her colleagues seen? When he arrived at the office, the receptionist's face immediately gave him pause. She looked pale, her eyes darting nervously as she avoided meeting his gaze. "Madeline's in the lounge area," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been here since early this morning." The lounge was down a narrow hallway, and as John approached, he noticed the faint but unmistakable smell of alcohol lingering in the air. His steps slowed, dread building with each passing second. He turned the corner, and there she was. Madeline sat slumped on a leather chair, her head resting against the back cushion at an awkward angle. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, clinging to her sweat-dampened forehead. The makeup she had carefully applied the previous evening was now smeared across her face, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark, accusing lines. Her lipstick was smudged far beyond the borders of her lips, and there was a faint reddish stain on the collar of her once elegant blouse. Her clothes were crumpled and wrinkled, as though she had slept in them, or worse, not removed them at all. One strap of her dress had slipped off her shoulder, exposing her bra strap and leaving her looking disheveled and vulnerable. Her bare feet were tucked under her heels discarded haphazardly on the floor. The acrid smell of stale alcohol hit John like a punch to the face, mingling with a hint of sweat and something else he couldn't quite place but that filled him with revulsion. John cleared his throat, but Madeline didn't stir. "Madeline," he said firmly. She opened her eyes groggily, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. When she saw him, her expression shifted from confusion to dread, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. "What the hell is going on?" John demanded, his voice low but seething with fury. Madeline sat up, wincing as she did so. I came here to clear my head," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "Clear your head?" John repeated, incredulous. "Looking like this? Smelling like you bathed in vodka?" "I didn't know where else to go," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "I just needed to get away." "Get away from what, exactly?" John pressed. "From me? From whatever happened last night that you're still not telling me?" Her silence was deafening, and John's patience snapped. He gestured around the room, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Your colleagues saw you like this. Your boss saw you like this. What am I supposed to think?" At the mention of her boss, Madeline visibly flinched. It was a subtle movement, but John caught it, and the knot in his stomach tightened further. "Martin," he said, his voice dripping with accusation. "Is this about him?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "It's not what you think, John." "Then explain it to me," he shouted. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you're hiding something." Madeline buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't or won't," John snapped. She didn't answer, and the room fell into an unbearable silence, broken only by her muffled sobs. John felt a surge of helpless rage. He wanted to shake the truth out of her, to force her to admit whatever it was that had brought them to this point. Instead, he stood there, fists clenched, feeling the weight of the humiliation pressing down on him. He was about to demand answers again when the door to the lounge creaked open. Jeremy stood there, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Smith? I didn't mean to interrupt, but maybe we should move this somewhere private?" John shot him a glare. "You mean it's not private enough with half the office already gossiping about this?" Jeremy swallowed hard, clearly regretting his decision to intervene. "I just thought—" "Don't," John interrupted, his tone icy. "Don't think. Just leave us." Jeremy hesitated, then nodded and backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. John turned back to Madeline, his voice softer but no less intense. I want the truth, Madeline. All of it. Right now. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and smeared makeup, her eyes glassy with fear and shame. I don't know where to start, she whispered. Start with the truth, John said coldly. The truth about last night. The truth about Martin. The truth about why you're sitting here looking like. He broke off, unable to bring himself to finish the sentence. Madeline's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked sob. John stared at her, his anger giving way to something far more painful, a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. He shook his head, turning toward the door. I can't do this right now, he said, his voice hollow. Get yourself cleaned up, Madeline. We'll talk at home. As he walked away, the whispers and stares of her colleagues followed him like shadows, each one a knife in his back. He felt humiliated, enraged, and utterly lost. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know if he could catch her, or if he even wanted to. When John and Madeline returned home, the silence between them was deafening. Madeline had spent the car ride staring out the window, her face a mask of shame and exhaustion. John, on the other hand, was a storm barely contained. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The tension hung heavy in the air, suffocating them both. As soon as they stepped inside, Madeline muttered something about needing a shower and disappeared upstairs without waiting for a response. John watched her go, his jaw clenched. He didn't try to stop her. Not yet. Left alone in the quiet of their living room, his gaze fell on Madeline's handbag, which she'd carelessly left on the couch. Her phone peeked out from the unzipped top, its screen dark but beckoning. A cold dread settled in his chest as he moved toward it, his steps hesitant but resolute. He knew he shouldn't. He knew invading her privacy was wrong. But the gnawing suspicion in his gut was too loud to ignore. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. Madeline had never been one to guard her phone, and sure enough, it wasn't locked. The home screen lit up, displaying a photo of the two of them from happier times, a trip to the beach last summer. John felt a pang of bitterness as he swiped to unlock it, the image now tainted by the events of the past 24 hours. His fingers hovered over the gallery app, a part of him praying he'd find nothing. But as the app opened, the first thumbnail made his stomach drop. It was a video. John tapped it, and the screen filled with footage from the corporate party. The sound of upbeat music and laughter blared from the speakers as the camera panned over a crowd of dancing coworkers. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just a group of colleagues letting loose after a long week. But then the camera shifted, and John's heart sank. There was Madeline, her movements unsteady, her smile too wide. She was on the dance floor, pressed against Martin, her boss. His hands were on her waist, holding her far too closely for comfort. She laughed, tossing her head back in a way John hadn't seen in years. Her hands rested on Martin's shoulders, and as the video continued, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered something. Martin's grin widened, and he pulled her closer, their bodies swaying in unison to the beat. John's breath hitched. He paused the video, unable to watch any further. His hand shook as he scrolled through the gallery, his pulse pounding in his ears. The next image was worse. It was a selfie, taken by one of her colleagues. Madeline was in the center, her cheeks flushed, a glass of champagne raised high in a toast. Behind her, Martin was visible again, his arm draped casually but intimately around her shoulders. Her expression was carefree, almost euphoric. A stark contrast to the woman he had picked up from the office just hours ago. John's chest tightened as he swiped through more photos and videos. Each one felt like a blow. There was another video, this one taken in what appeared to be a private lounge. Madeline sat on a couch, her dress riding dangerously high, laughing as Martin poured her another drink. Another man, a colleague John didn't recognize, sat beside her, his hand resting just above her knee. The way she leaned into him, laughing at something he said, made John's skin crawl. The worst was yet to come. In one video, Madeline was sitting in Martin's lap, her arms wrapped loosely around his neck. He was whispering something into her ear, his hand resting on her thigh. She giggled, tilting her head back, and to John's horror, she kissed him. It wasn't a fleeting, drunken mistake. It was deliberate, lingering, and far too passionate for a married woman. John dropped the phone onto the coffee table as though it had burned him. He stared at it, his mind reeling. His heart raced, the betrayal crashing over him in waves. How could she? How could the woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with do this? His thoughts spiraled into darker territory. Was this the first time? Or had there been others? He thought of the key card from the night before, the way she had flinched at the mention of Martin's name, and the humiliation of seeing her in that state at the office. Every detail now seemed to confirm his worst fears. A sound from upstairs jolted him from his thoughts. The shower had turned off. Madeline would be coming down soon. The thought filled him with both dread and fury. He had to confront her. There was no avoiding it now. Moments later, Madeline appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair damp, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She had changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, her expression guarded. She hesitated when she saw him standing in the living room, her eyes darting to the phone on the table. "John," she began, her voice tentative. "I know you're angry, but—" "Don't," he cut her off, his voice cold and steely. "Don't even try to explain." Her eyes widened in alarm. "What are you talking about?" He picked up her phone and held it out toward her, his hand trembling with rage. "This," he spat. "I saw everything, Madeline. The photos. The videos. Your little show at the party." Madeline's face drained of color. "John, don't lie to me," he roared, his voice echoing through the room. "I saw you with Martin. I saw you kissing him. I saw you letting another man put his hands all over you like you didn't have a husband waiting at home." Tears welled in her eyes, but John felt no sympathy. "It was a mistake," she said weakly. "I was drunk." "That's your excuse?" he shouted. "You were drunk? Do you think that makes it okay? Do you think that erases what you did?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking about me, that's for damn sure," he snapped. "Or about our marriage. Or about how humiliated I'd feel knowing everyone at that party saw my wife behaving like." "Stop," she cried, covering her face with her hands. John took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Oh, you don't get to cry, Madeline. You don't get to play the victim here. You did this. You betrayed me." Madeline collapsed onto the couch, her sobs racking her body. John stood over her, his fists clenched, his mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disbelief. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain: their marriage would never be the same. The silence in the living room was suffocating, broken only by Madeline's muffled sobs. John stood across from her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. The phone sat on the coffee table between them, a damning artifact of her betrayal. His stomach churned with anger, disgust, and a deep, gnawing sense of heartbreak. "Explain," he said finally, his voice cold and sharp as broken glass. Madeline looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. Her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap, and her lips trembled as she struggled to find the words. "John, don't you dare tell me it wasn't what it looks like," he snapped, cutting her off. "I saw the videos, Madeline. I saw the pictures. You were draped all over him. You kissed him. And that wasn't all. So don't insult me by pretending it's just some misunderstanding." Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. "I was drunk," she whispered. "I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." "Drunk?" John repeated, his voice rising. "You think blaming it on alcohol makes it better? Do you honestly expect me to believe that one too many glasses of champagne just magically made you forget you're married?" She shook her head, her sobs intensifying. "It's not like that. I swear, John. It wasn't planned. It just got out of hand." John let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Got out of hand? Is that what you call it? Let me tell you what I saw, Madeline. I saw my wife sitting in her boss's lap, letting him put his hands all over her. I saw you kissing him. I saw you letting another man touch you in ways he had no right to. And you're going to sit there and tell me it was just the alcohol? She looked up at him, desperation etched into every line of her face. I wasn't myself, John. You were yourself, he interrupted, his voice trembling with fury. You were just the worst version of yourself. The version that thought it was okay to throw away everything we've built for, what? A few cheap thrills at an office party? To impress Martin? To feel what desired again? Her silence was deafening, and John felt his stomach drop. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to keep his voice steady. Was it worth it? Tell me, Madeline. Was it worth destroying our marriage? I didn't mean to destroy anything, she cried, her voice breaking. It was a mistake, John. A terrible, stupid mistake. I love you. You have to believe me. John's laugh was cold and humorless. Love? You call this love? Because I sure as hell don't feel loved right now. I feel betrayed. Humiliated. Do you have any idea what it was like to see you like that? To see the woman I thought I knew acting like a stranger? I wasn't thinking. Stop saying that, he shouted, slamming his hand down on the coffee table. The sharp sound echoed through the room, making her flinch. You keep saying you weren't thinking, but that's not an excuse. You made choices, Madeline. You chose to let him touch you. You chose to kiss him. You chose to keep going, even when you must have known it was wrong. Her sobs quieted, and she stared down at her lap, her shoulders hunched in defeat. I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I can't change what happened. What I want, John said, his voice shaking, is the truth. The real truth, not some half-assed excuse about alcohol or bad judgment. I want to know why, Madeline. Why would you do this to us? To me? She hesitated, her hands twisting together. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Not good enough, John snapped. Try again. I felt lost, she admitted, her voice cracking. I felt lost for a long time. Work has been so stressful, and I've been feeling invisible. Like no one sees me anymore. And Martin, he made me feel noticed. Wanted. I wasn't thinking about what it would mean, You just wanted to feel good, John finished for her, his voice dripping with disdain. And to hell with the consequences, right? To hell with me? That's not fair, she protested weakly. I wasn't trying to hurt you. But you did, he shouted, the words exploding out of him. You did hurt me, Madeline. You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool in front of your colleagues. Do you know how many of them saw you like that? How many of them will never look at me the same way again because of what you did? Her face crumpled again, and she reached out toward him. John, please. I know I screwed up, but I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just give me a chance to make it right. He stepped back, out of her reach, his expression cold. You don't get to make demands right now. You don't get to decide what happens next. You lost that right the moment you decided to betray me. Her sobs filled the silence again, but John felt no sympathy. He turned away, his hands gripping the back of the couch as he tried to steady himself. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the humiliation, the loss, pressed down on him like a physical force. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I need time to think. To figure out if there's even anything left to save here. Because right now, Madeline, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Her sobs grew louder, but he didn't turn back. Instead, he walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and the shattered pieces of their life together. John sat in the quiet of the guest bedroom, staring at the wall as the weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical burden. The events of the past few days had unraveled his life in ways he could never have imagined. The love, trust, and companionship he had once shared with Madeline now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the searing pain of betrayal and humiliation. He thought about the evidence he'd seen, videos, photos, and her own weak, stammered excuses. He thought about the colleagues who had likely seen her behavior at the party, about Martin and the smug satisfaction the man must feel for humiliating him so thoroughly. But mostly, he thought about himself, the version of John that had walked into this marriage with hope and trust, and the broken man he had become. As the clock struck midnight, John made his decision. It wasn't one he had arrived at lightly, but the clarity of it now seemed undeniable. There was no salvaging what they had. The betrayal ran too deep, and his trust in her was irreparably shattered. He needed to move on, to rebuild his life without her. The next morning, he found Madeline sitting in the kitchen. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She had dressed in an old sweatshirt and leggings, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a far cry from the composed and elegant woman she had once been. As he entered the room, she looked up at him, her expression filled with a mix of guilt and hope. "John," she began, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking about what you said. I know I've hurt you, and I'm willing to do anything, to fix this." John didn't sit down. He remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest as he stared down at her. "There's nothing to fix, Madeline," he said coldly. "It's over." Her eyes widened, her face crumpling as fresh tears began to spill down her cheeks. "What do you mean, over?" she choked out. "John, please don't say that. We can work through this. I know I've made mistakes, but we've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." "I'm not the one who threw it away," he shot back, his voice hard. "You did that the moment you decided to humiliate me. The moment you let another man put his hands on you. The moment you chose your own selfish desires over our marriage." "It wasn't like that," she protested, rising to her feet. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight." "Stop blaming the alcohol," John snapped, his voice rising. "You weren't so drunk that you didn't know what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing, Madeline. And now, you're going to face the consequences." She took a step toward him, her hands clasped in front of her as though in prayer. "Please, John," she begged. "Don't give up on us. We can go to counseling. We can work through this together. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "You can't make this right, Madeline. You betrayed me, and I'll never be able to look at you the same way again. Every time I see you, I'll think about what you did, about how little I meant to you in that moment. I deserve better than that. I deserve better than you." Her breath hitched, and she staggered back as though he had struck her. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You can't mean that." "I do," he said firmly. "This marriage is over. I want a divorce." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Madeline stared at him, her face pale and stricken. "John, no," she whispered. "Please, no. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can—" "Stop," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her pleas. "I've made up my mind. I want you to pack your things and leave." Her eyes filled with panic. "Leave? You're kicking me out of my own home?" "This stopped being your home the moment you betrayed me," he said coldly. "I don't care where you go, stay with a friend, get a hotel, I don't care. But you're not staying here." She shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. "You can't do this, John. Please, just give me a chance to prove I can change." "Change?" he repeated bitterly. "You mean like you changed when you let Martin paw at you like a piece of meat? Or when you kissed him? Or when you sat there and let another man put his hand on your leg? Face it, Madeline, this isn't who you became overnight. This is who you are. And I want no part of it." Madeline sank back into her chair, her sobs echoing through the room. John felt no pity for her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. "I'll give you until the end of the week," he said flatly. "That's more than fair. After that, I don't want to see you here again." She looked up at him, her face twisted in anguish. "What about us?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about the life we built together? Does that mean nothing to you?" "It meant everything to me," he said quietly. "But it clearly didn't mean anything to you." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with her tears. As he climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom, he felt a strange sense of relief. The decision had been made. The marriage was over. Now, it was time to start picking up the pieces of his life and moving forward, without her.